Kula, my name is Alex, and my doctoral research project is on young Chinese diaspora's experience of sexuality education in New Zealand. Now, one good thing about this project is it's always a very good conversation starter. You get a few raised eyebrows when the word sexuality is mentioned, and people would often ask me, why? What makes you choose this topic? It's actually a very good question. So over time, I realized my personal background does inform my interest in the topic and the kind of investigation I want to engage with. So I arrived in New Zealand more than 10 years ago as an international student, became a new Chinese migrant 4 years ago, and did my master's in feminist psychology last year. So as I grow increasingly aware of my own identity as a Chinese woman overseas, I finally start to understand the famous feminist slogan, "The personal is political." So given my position in this research, I'm able to offer some reflexive critique of existing research on the topic. And I noticed that, have I been pressing it? Yeah, I noticed that the ways Chinese young people's sexuality is represented in existing research is very polarized. Like the pictures you have here, you have the hardworking, almost nerd-looking Chinese students featuring many university websites, including our university websites. And you have the exotic sexual bombshell that you see on websites like Find Your Chinese Wife or AsianBeauty.com. So these representations, they really come down to one seemingly self-contradictory profile that Chinese young people are sexually conservative and simultaneously sexually reckless. So together, these two facets work to exotify Chinese young people as a group other to the ethnic majority in a given society in terms of sexuality. So is this profile really representative of Chinese people's sexuality, and what is underlying such assumptions? We'll look at these two facets separately. According to research, Chinese young people are more conservative compared to their white counterparts. In these many ways, they're generally less sexually knowledgeable or experienced, having more conservative attitudes, experiencing higher rates of anxiety from anticipated sexual activities. This idea may be linked to a perception of Chinese young people as ideal pupils, highly invested in academic pursuits to the point of being asexual. So there is strong emphasis on education across Chinese cultures. So young people's sexual or romantic relationships are often deemed as interference to their study by the parents. So young people may be under more supervision and may be less likely to be able to access their sexual autonomy. But what is wrong with this representation? Firstly, a major limitation with comparative research is it relies on imposing Western paradigms on ethnic minority groups by assuming Western values and practices as the standard. And a lot of studies use constructs or measures that are not necessarily culturally universal, therefore psychometrically problematic. Secondly, there is a disparity between Chinese's sexual practice in private and public expression of sexuality due to cultural norms that decree against open discussion of sexuality. So the conservatism we reported that we see in research may actually be overrepresented. Lastly, Chinese diaspora's sexuality is intersected with the process of acculturation. Some Chinese women in overseas countries report shifts in their gender role attitudes as well as sexual practice in post-immigrant lives that very much diverge from conservatism. The other side of this profile is sexual recklessness. This often implied in research driven by public health agenda that focuses on negative outcomes of young people's sexual activeness. So in New Zealand, Chinese international students and recent immigrants are seen as particularly problematic groups in terms of sexual health, as abortion rates among these groups have received a lot of media attention in the last decade. So these young people are believed to be lonely, isolated, impressionable, without family support, promiscuous, and ignorant about sexuality. So my critique of this representation, firstly, mainstream scholarship adopts a Eurocentric framework, which tends to accentuate non-Western groups' differences as the other, such as the construction of young people's sexual activeness as promiscuous. Also, research assumes a direct link between young people's acquisition of sexual knowledge and their safer sexual practice. So it follows that without proper knowledge, young people's sexual activeness is deemed reckless. Of course, this assumption is problematic as identified by a knowledge-practice gap observed in sex education research worldwide. Lastly, sexual health research in New Zealand is very much informed by neoliberalism that focuses on individualized health rhetoric. So it's basically saying you reap what you sow. Vulnerable groups and risk individuals, they are vulnerable. They're responsible for their own vulnerability as consequences of their reckless actions. So together, these two facets compose a profile of an exotic other. Chinese sexuality, in particular Chinese femininity, is often problematized for being either overly passive or excessively wild. Now, such constructions of sexuality are very restrictive and limiting and operate as oppressive discourses. It can be also detrimental to young women's sexual health because caught in the bind between hypersexualization by racial stereotyping and traditional cultural messages demanding them to downplay their sexuality, Chinese young women, they may struggle with developing comfort with their sexuality and sexual expression. And research indicates that sexual autonomy and efficacy plays a crucial role in young women's assertiveness in intimate situations, therefore their sexual safety. Additionally, this exotifying tendency in research assumptions may impede us from developing a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of Chinese young people's sexuality, such as how they conform to and resist dominant discourses, how they make sense of their own sexual practices, healthy or risky or otherwise. And that is where I hope my research would come in. So I argue that tapping into young people's sexual subjectivity open up critical ways of representing their sexuality that are alternative to the homogenizing presumptions I mentioned earlier, and will reveal important implications of their sexual health for researchers as well as educators. So that's my central research question. How do Chinese young people become sexual subjects as diasporas in New Zealand? The research sample is defined as ethnic Chinese of 18 to 25 from mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, or young people with parents born in these places. It's including both international students and immigrant youth. This ecological model gives an outline of the dimensions involved in sexuality education. So different from sex education, sexuality education has a more holistic approach. And it could occur in classrooms or elsewhere, officially or unofficially. So young people's experience of it is subject to influences from these multiple levels. And more importantly, I emphasize the individual level, and I want to find out how individual agency operates in young people's negotiation of these social processes. So this means I need a theoretical position that allows me to see sexuality as constituted by its social and institutional context, and simultaneously acknowledges these young peoples as active subjects with agency to rework and resist the power enacted in social institutions. So I think my research will be informed by feminist post-structuralism and Foucault and Butler's idea of power. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Any questions?